Welcome back to our show. I'm Alexa, your netball bestie, and together with Jenna, this is Your Netball Besties. This is where we deep dive into SSN game analysis and what the netball world is currently talking about. We've just finished round 11 of the Suncorp Super Netball, and every week we have games that get so close and ping pong back and forth at this point. It's nearly impossible to accurately predict any outcome. I personally am sitting at 1 out of 4 in my tipping. I thought the Giants would get me over the line to at least 50%, but no joy. How did you go?
I think I'm at the point where I've just given up on tipping. We've gotten to such an unpredictable point, but I mean, I guess that keeps things exciting though, doesn't it?
I mean, when you have like games like the Giants just kind of coming out of nowhere and like dominating the last two games, and then Swifts, like they had that solid lead for a while. Obviously, we'll go into that. But like when you have games like that, like it is so hard to predict who's actually going to win. Okay, Jenna, can you please break down the games and the scores for us?
Yep, so on Friday night we had the Fever beat the Thunderbirds 68 to 63. On Saturday we then had the Vixens beat the Lightning 68 to 65. Sorry, Alexa. Then on Sunday we had the Swifts take the win over the Giants 75 to 66. And then we finished the round out with the Mavs beating the Firebirds 65 to 54.
Okay, so first game of the round was a Friday night game that we both went to, and that was Fever versus Thunderbirds. And this game did not disappoint. We were just talking earlier, Jenna, about we didn't take notes on every single game, and this was one that I didn't take as many notes. So luckily you did. When I'm watching the games live in person, I really struggle, and I've said this before, I really struggle to like separate the emotional ride out of it. I'm just kind of in it. So I've made some notes from what I remember, but you're going to have to take the lead on this one. So I noticed there was a clear strategy with both teams were to double defend the two tall holding shooters. So both ends being double defended, and then both GAs having a fairly clean run into those circle and having those drives. The second half of the game, we had that change with Liv Wilkinson come on and Beckford come off, which at this point definitely just seems like the just the absolute blueprint of what Dan and Fever are sticking to. Beckford does the first half of the game and Liv does the second half of the game, and to varying degrees of impact in that second half. Obviously, we have questioned whether this was the best choice, but Dan knows what he's doing. So, Fever still won the game in the end.
Yeah, I think whenever the Fever and the T-Birds go up, it's a very similar strategy sort of game. They are teams that traditionally do lean into that more 1 point sort of game. And I mean, we have been recently seeing the Thunderbirds trying to incorporate more super shots. And I think in this game in particular, Fever were also doing the same, which I actually think is probably a good thing for them, considering who they're probably most likely going to go up against in a potential grand final. So I think sort of getting the familiar with that now is it's probably the time to do it. Of course, we had no love lost in the circle between Dehaney and Romelda Aiken, which we saw a lovely replay of a elbow to the face. I'm going to call it intentional elbow to the face, but there was definitely a lot of push and shove going on in there. As you said as well, the double defense, I did notice that as well. I also noticed that Latanya had really great elevation on Fowler, but you just can't, you're always going to come second when you're going up against someone who just can absolutely, the strength on the take is just wild. But I did notice there were times where I felt like Garrett was getting quite under her feet. So she was struggling to get to land properly. A lot of it was pressured. I thought the T-Birds had some really good mid-court defensive pressure. Like you could tell they went into that knowing they had to slow the mid-court down. And there were times where Fever were getting quite congested and stuck in there. Luckily for Fever, they were able to sort of push through. Brew was really good. She had a hot hand for majority of the game. Bit of a shame about the accuracy dropping off towards the end there. But, this was definitely one of those games, there was hunger in this win. We saw a lot of elbows and hits, and we saw Shanice get a couple falcons to the face and cop an elbow and came off looking like she was in a lot of pain. So I'm glad that she was okay because it didn't look too good. But it was a juicy, juicy game, that's for sure.
So the things that I wanted to ask your opinion on, Jenna, were two other things that I noticed. The first is, yeah, I think everyone noticed that Fowler was definitely being affected on her takes more so than we've ever seen her before. She is normally a player who, when she takes the ball in the air on her land, she's very, very steady. And there were a couple of occasions, like probably at least 5 or 6 occasions, where she looked like she was off balance on one foot, really having to engage that core strength to get her balance on the take. And I guess you've mentioned it now that so your interpretation of that was that you thought Garrett was perhaps kind of in her space a bit too much where she was landing.
Yeah, I definitely think there were times where she was landing, there was not much room for her to land, but the defenders are supposed to give the shooters room to land. So I think maybe that was a tactical thing to put her under pressure, because then we did see a couple times where she essentially didn't really have any space to land, and that was when she sort of, fumbled it. So I think that could possibly be a strategic. I mean, not a great thing, but strategy nonetheless.
What I was wondering was if this was essentially what we're seeing for the first time ever, an Achilles heel in the new strategy that Janelle has brought into her game. So obviously we've seen her moving a lot more, jumping a lot more, being a lot more agile and fitter in the 2025 season than we've ever seen her before. So perhaps the fact that she is, I guess, jumping more and being more agile just affects that option to be kind of bumped on the contest in the air more so than she's ever been used to before.
I think as well, credit to like Latanya Wilson. Those Jamaicans' aerial gameplay is just second to none, and I think that as well. There were no easy takes, and had Laddie been playing like that against any other shooter, she would have been winning so much ball.
The other thing that I wanted to mention was, and I talked about this in my tipping video before the game as well, is I was really expecting for Tanya Ops to bring on that moving shooting circle a lot sooner. I actually think this is where T-Birds lost the game because obviously we saw them recently implement this new strategy. And it wasn't as successful as they'd hoped because both of the shooters weren't on their game in regards to accuracy on that particular day. But today was not that day, or this particular game wasn't that day. Fru was on fire. Her accuracy was amazing. And I was really expecting to see that Georgie Fru circle a lot sooner. But when we saw it, was in the last 3 minutes of the fourth quarter. And we didn't even see the moving circle. What we actually saw was Fru taken off, and then Georgie moved into that GA bib, and then Kayla moved into the wing attack bib. I was confused at the rationale of taking Fru off after 2 super shot misses, given that she had, at this point, been so accurate and she had, I think, gotten about 7 or 8 super shots across the game. So to then be like, oh, 2 misses, you're off, put Georgie on in a desperate last 3 minutes change up.
Yeah, so I've actually watched this game back a couple times now,
Of course
especially
you
the
have.
very
Of course
stressful
you have.
ending. Yeah, yeah. And what actually happened was it was an Tanya Obst was screaming at her team for a timeout, but there wasn't a goal scored yet, so they couldn't get a time. So obviously, time's ticking down. By the time the goal finally got scored by Fever, they didn't call a timeout, but it was actually injury time. So with injury time, there was no choice, but Fru had to go to the bench. And then that's when we saw Graham come on.
Okay, all right. I didn't know that. That makes a lot more sense as to why Fru was taken off the court
Yeah.
because that was definitely a shocking change. But again, I'm still kind of I still think that we should have seen the duo of the super shot duo in the circle much sooner. I think that Fru was under a lot of pressure, and even though she was doing an amazing job, it's just would have been that situation where they actually have a super shot duo available, whereas Fever don't. Fever have super shot shooters who can shoot accurately sometimes, but when Thunderbirds are on, like if you had Fru and Georgie in that circle together, that would be like having two Helen Housebys some days. Like that is a very, very strong super shot duo. I honestly think that if they had done that, they would have just had a better outcome.
Yeah, I think it was such a close game in the end there. It could have I don't think I've ever seen Tanya Obbs as animated as I saw her in that game. Would have really I think that was the smart move would have been to bring her on. But oh my goodness, was it a fight.
Everyone went in overly confident that it would be a Fever win. I also do want to mention as well to anyone who did go to the game and didn't understand perhaps why there was a little bit of an emergency as we were leaving the RAC arena. I just want to respectfully mention that unfortunately someone did lose their life in a traffic accident outside the building. So that is why we were all made to leave in a separate way and the streets were blocked off. So definitely not the way that you want to end the night after what was otherwise a pretty great experience. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that because I'm sure there is a lot of people still speculating or wondering perhaps what happened, but unfortunately, it was a pretty serious situation. The second game of the round was on Saturday. This was the Lightning versus Vixens game, and another game that we expected it to be very highly contested because this is probably the most diamonds we ever get to see on the court at once. We literally have a diamonds filled Lightning and Vixens starting seven. Major outs to note, though, that were definitely, I think, a swing in how this game went, and that was Cara Conan was out of this game for a foot injury. I'm really worried about how serious that is. And then we also had Hannah Mundy out for the Vixens for also a foot injury. Everyone says that foot injuries can be quite serious, so I'm really hoping that this doesn't mean the end of their seasons because we do only have, what, 3 more rounds. It was still an amazing game. So in the first quarter, we had both teams starting really, really strong. Steph was shooting well, which was a huge relief, given that, she hadn't had her best couple of rounds previously. It was really nice to see she was on her absolute A game, particularly because she would have had to be. She knew that at that point with Cara out of the circle, she would have had to really step up her leadership. In the second quarter, we saw a really clear disconnect between the Lightning defenders. It was something the commentators were noting a lot. And once they had noted it, it was kind of impossible not to see. We saw moments where Tara wasn't really taking Courtney's direction on in the circle, so it was kind of really falling apart for them. I really liked how the Vixens defenders were working together to make the attacking end in Lightning work overtime. I mean, like literally overtime. I would love to see a comparison of how many passes it took Lightning to get the ball through the hoop compared to Vixens because it really felt like for every one pass that Vixens took, Lightning were taking 3 to get the same result. So definitely kudos to the defensive team on Vixens for creating that extra pressure. And then we saw the Vixens win that second quarter quite convincingly and go into the second half with a solid lead. Jenna, what were your thoughts on the first half?
It was such a solid start from both sides. I think Kira Austin and Riley Bachelor were just on from the get-go, which was really nice. Watching the first half of the game, you definitely probably wouldn't have expected the second half of the game to almost change as much like it did. There were times where you could almost see where Steph and Riley, like, they'd almost look to the base and no one was driving it. Like, you could tell they were missing Kara's leads. And I do actually think if Kara were there, I think they may have gotten across the line. I think she was a big out and it did leave a bit of like confusion almost in the circle for them. They didn't have that backup option. Yeah, I agree that the defenders for Lightning, there was just such a disconnect. And even when we saw Ash Irvin come on, I mean, we've seen Ash Irvin just absolutely doing an incredible job, intercepts and grabbing balls and everything like that. But I feel like it was almost like we were just watching her watch the ball going over very easily to Garvin. I feel like Garvin and Kira, they just had the free run. It looked so easy for them to get ball down to their end. I did also notice something that we have been noticing as well. There were so many passes in the Lightning shooting circle. Again, we need to just catch ball, turn, shoot, especially when there's so many passes just to land in the exact same spot. Why? Just turn, shoot, So I don't know, was that could that have been contributed to defensive pressure or hand over the shot by the Vixens, or is it their own personal confidence? I would have liked to see them just back themselves and sort of go for it.
So in the third quarter, we actually saw a few fumbles and errors start to pile up in the shooting end for the Vixens, but the Lightning just were not able to capitalize on those areas at all, and it just went straight back to the Vixens. We saw Irvin come on and have quite a few deflections. She had a lot of tips here and there, but that were, again, not picked up by a Lightning player, so they just kind of fell to nothing, unfortunately. It's like that, that whole defensive duo that we hear spoken about so much is that working as a team is that if one player gets that deflection, you need someone there as backup to pick up, which is usually something we see Tara do a lot. Tara is normally amazing at getting those, the pickups from the deflections. And we just did not see that happen in this game. When Belinda switched up Steph and Rue, so we saw Steph move into GS and Rue come out to a GA, her goal was to create more movement, and that is exactly what happened because Steph is such a moving player, and that we had essentially like a moving circle on steroids in this section. But unfortunately, still, it just didn't have the result that Belinda was hoping for. I think that Rue is an incredible player with a huge future, but there really is no mistaking that she's just not as strong as Steph and Kara based on how much experience they have, not only together, but individually. You can be the most accurate shooter in the world, and like we see this with Matisse as well, but you have to be available to receive the ball. You have to be able to get yourself in a position away from defenders where the feeders can get ball in hand, because it doesn't matter how accurate you are if you're not actually getting enough attempts at shooting. So there was a funny moment in the third quarter where the camera cut to Emma Barry, who was the replacement player that Lightning had brought in, who I think we've just found out, Jenna, you and I, that she is not only a GS, but she can also play GK, which is, multi-skilled. That's amazing. But it was really funny because the camera cut to her sitting on the bench and Kath Cox says, "Oh, yep, there's Irvin sitting on the bench. She's back off again." And it took them a moment to realize that it was literally a completely different player because they look so similar. I thought it was really interesting in the third quarter, the commentators were talking about how many sprays and words that a lot of the players were having on the court, in particular, the one with Mahalia and Walters. I wish we had a mic on this. Oh my God, this would be like all my Christmases coming at once. I am such a nosy bitch. I want to know what they're saying.
Yeah, bring in mic'd up netball games. They do swear a lot on court. You don't realize it till you're sat courtside and I'm watching them oh my God.
Oh, I love that. I'm a potty mouth. I'm all for that. So in the third quarter, we also saw Lightning really start to sink their super shots and try desperately to get themselves back in the game. But the Vixens' defense was absolutely smothering at this point. So then we went into the fourth quarter with, again, like you mentioned, Jenna, and like we feel like we mention way too often, way too much ball movement by Lightning. What I noticed in particular, and this is something that Liz does a lot, but that normally works for her, is she does a lot of those short front cuts to, get front position and get that short pass and move the ball down that center corridor. But we saw that essentially overdone because then other players were starting to do it as well. And it just felt like this congested short pass where the defenders were just completely smothering and they were almost unable to create space out of that center corridor at all. Whereas we saw the Vixens do the absolute opposite and they were finding space and creating space so beautifully. It's one of those things that we know that is such a blueprint tactic of how Liz plays and how she's, arguably the best wing attack in the world. But I think that becomes less impactful when the other players aren't creating the space. And then it just becomes, like I said, overly congested. Surprisingly, and against all odds, Lightning actually won the fourth quarter, but it just wasn't enough. And we have seen this a couple of times from them now where they managed to, get their shit together in the fourth quarter, but it's just not enough to get them over the line. I think when was the last time we saw that happen? Was that last week against the Giants, I think? I think who
Yeah, that would have been last week.
what I thought was interesting was how much the commentators really drilled in on how important this game was for both of these teams in regards to placement on the ladder. So Lightning have three really hard games for the remainder of this season, which is why this game was so particularly important for them to win, because their next three games are Fever, Swifts, and then Thunderbirds. So really, really hard games ahead for them. The second game on Saturday and the third game of the round was Giants versus Swifts. This was definitely the game of the round for me. Everyone was waiting on the results of this New South Wales derby because essentially of how both of these teams are sitting performance wise at this point in the competition. So we have Giants who have been on an absolute winning peak, which no one could have predicted. And then again, on the other end, you have Swift's back-to-back losses and definitely having a complete lull and a strategy fall apart in what's been working with them so far. I was disappointed for the Giants, but I was like really happy for the Swifts because they really worked hard. So Giants continued their strong play. They started amazingly. They won this first quarter by 11 goals. It was such an impressive quarter, and the Swifts were just absolutely stunned. They didn't have an answer for it. It definitely took a lot of, I think, restructuring and going back to, the coaching room and figuring out what was going on for them to essentially change everything they were doing, because the Giants had them completely worked out. This was the most clinical that we'd ever seen the Giants play before. Their super shots were incredible. And this is the kind of game where you have super shot giants on both teams. So you always know that it's going to be a high super shot game, and whoever wins the 1 point game is going to win the game at the end. So we had no Verity for the Swifts, and we had Ali Smith back, and then we also had Fawns back in the lineup. In the second quarter, this is where things started to change for the Giants. So the Giants lost their 11 goal lead down to 8. And at this point, we were all screaming at the TV for Julie to call a timeout because the momentum had clearly shifted. Luckily, she did. Just to note, this was probably what the worst super shot game I've ever seen from Housby. Definitely her worst percentage that we've seen in a very, very long time. And we saw Kopua and O'Brien having another A grade performance against them. Jenna, what were your thoughts on the first half?
So once again, we saw Giants starting really strong, and I also was silently hoping that they could get the job done. But I guess my biggest worry when it comes to Giants is they seem to really struggle to just maintain a 60-minute performance. And this was one of those games where it was essential. While they had so many opportunities to get that little bit ahead and keep the lead, we really did see them completely quieten up in the second half. And we also saw a little bit of the accuracy start to slip towards the end with the super shot time, which when going for a super shot, I would actually like to see the second shooter also posting up for the rebound just in case, because there are times where they would go up for the two, they would miss, and they would just watch the defender get the ball. Then I just keep thinking, at least post up and try and get the one instead. I feel like little tactical things like that would have helped a little bit more. And I know that we also spoke a lot about a while back now, like when Swifts get figured out, what are they going to do, sort of thing. And I think keeping Sophie Fawns in the team was a good move, because I think it is being proven that they do need that second super shot option. Grace isn't a super shotter. She is the more traditional 1 point shooter. So I think having Sophie there will be interesting. I was very interested to see Verity out, so I'm curious to whether or not they'll keep that same lineup next week. But yeah, Swifts then sort of started playing with a little bit more freedom in the last, and they were just able to get the job done in the end.
At the beginning of the third quarter, this is where things really, really changed. So the Swifts came out absolutely firing. They had a 6-goal run at one point, which then essentially changed the leaderboard to a 12-2 lead in this third quarter. So an absolute switch up, change around compared to what we saw in the first quarter. Whatever Bryony had said to them at halftime absolutely worked. there was a real bouncing back and forth in the Giants at this point. So every time they'd get a game back in defense, they would then lose it with, an error in attack. And it just became a bit of like a ping pong there where defense could really not do any more than what they were doing. And unfortunately, the attack weren't able to finish. I really loved Sligo in this game. She is just really proving herself to be an absolute, Diamond's future. Definitely going to be people fighting over that contract for the future seasons because we saw her have a really clean intercept. And then as it was passed back, then that was lost on a weak pass, and we saw White intercept it. And then again, another weak pass from Swifts, and then Sligo intercepted it again. And it was just, yeah, it was quite entertaining to be honest. But I think that she is just absolutely going from strength to strength. No one I can think of is better for her to learn from than Jamie Lee Price. I think they play a very similar style. They're both really strong mid-court players, very defense heavy mid-court players, and I've loved seeing how her game has really blossomed with having such a close vicinity with JLP. We saw the Giants start to chip back a little bit in their lead, and then we had the super shot period, which unfortunately for me was a real low point in this game. We saw quite a few boos, and this was literally for no reason. All that happened was Clow got called on, I think, like a contact call, like a contact on the land with her hold over Joe's shot in the super shot. So then Joe got to take that shot again. And the boos in the stadium, it just, for me, that's a huge ick. Like, I don't like booze in general, but for situations like that, it just feels so unnecessary.
No, I agree. I don't like booing.
I remember when I did a video about this once to TikTok like a year ago, and I couldn't believe how many people defend booing. Like they think it's like just part of the
Mm.
game, and it's like they enjoy the participating in that booing. And I just feel like it's so not in the spirit of the game at all. Like it's just I for me, no situation is defending that. Even if it was like a horrific like contact, maybe even a deliberate contact, like I would be like like shocked, and I would expect the umpires to intervene and for like suitable consequences for something that was really bad. But I still don't think booing is justified.
We have to honorably mention as well how strong Jamie Lee Price is
Mm,
on the take.
my God.
That girl, she was completely unfazed. She just looked down and there was Tegan O'Shaughnessy on the floor having a minute. And she's literally standing there holding the ball. Not even, I don't even think she even moved a second. I think it was probably a second too late of a challenge. I don't think Tegan was going to get there first.
Nah, she was
But
she was never going
yeah,
to get there. Such a soft spot for Jamie Lee Price. I just think she's just so beautiful and strong and just like,
oh,
she's so impressive. And I know that, there are naysayers who I guess like think that she's too on body contact, but she's not. She's no more on body contact than anyone else in the court. The difference is she's so strong that she's the only one that doesn't hit the ground.
exactly. I think people just ricochet off of her most of the time because she can hold her own so well. But I was actually screaming a little bit at the TV because I noticed as soon as O'Shaughnessy fell, her arm was bleeding, and no one had picked it up, and we saw the blood dripping down. And I'm going, blood rule. Someone call time. Someone noticed she's bleeding, and the game's going on, and no one's calling it. And I'm going, oh my god, she's bleeding.
I didn't notice it until there was that confusion with trying to call a timeout. Was that this game?
Yeah,
Yeah, we've had a couple of hard hits and contests this round as well, which I really want to talk to you about at the end of this as well, in regards to where we, again, reassessing the same subject of where are we drawing the line with dangerous play and continued play and consequences and things like that. Because obviously, yeah, we'll get into more detail about that later on, but definitely something for us to talk about. Going into the fourth quarter, at this point, we really needed Giants to put O'Brien back on. I know that in the third quarter, they brought Tilly on and O'Brien was on the bench. I think we saw a really serious dip in Giants' performance when that happened. And so, yeah, it was no surprises at all that in the fourth quarter, Julie brought O'Brien back into that defense circle with Kopua. They are just together a much better match for a moving circle like Fawns and Houseby. in the fourth quarter, the Swifts had really solidified their lead at this point, and the Giants had completely switched into chase mode, despite them trying very hard in timeout huddles to, rev up their positive energy and their confidence again. We really saw this dip and the wheels start to fall off. We had Matisse come on the court and do her best. We had that hard knock that you mentioned between O'Shaughnessy and JLP. We had the Giants lost complete control. Swifts led by 3 ahead of the super shot period, which is absolute danger alarm bells. So as expected in that super shot time period, Housby and Fawns absolutely dominated. Housby really got her eye back in after having a fairly, touch and go in the beginning half of the game. She was phenomenal as always, an absolute clutch player, indisputable. The MVPs were actually a dual MVP of Paige Hadley and Tegan O'Shaughnessy, which I can't remember in recent memory that happening before, but very well deserved in what an intense comeback this was for the Swifts.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Do you have any more thoughts on the second half?
No, because I got too stressed in the end. I had to walk away.
You what? Oh, that's actually hilarious. Fourth game of the round on Sunday, we had the Mavs versus Firebirds. This was not a great performance from either team, in my opinion. I think they both had good moments, but they both had a lot of not great moments as well. So there was a strong start from the Mavs. They essentially, it was rinse and repeat of the Giants and Swifts game with this lead. They took the first quarter with an 11-goal lead against the Firebirds, and it just felt like the Firebirds just didn't have a chance here. We again saw Glasgow taking so many passes out in the shooting circle to get closer. So unnecessarily, again, I'm just bewildered by why she's choosing to do this when she is a long range shooter. She's tall. She doesn't really need to keep like 3 passes out to get closer to the circle is, in my opinion, 2 passes too many, and so much opportunity for like Ruby, who did really get her hand in, for Shira as well. Like it's just was too predictable. We saw Mary do a couple of layups in which at these points, I'm wondering why. So I can understand why layups are useful in certain plays and certain situations in a circle, but I find that sometimes she does that step in and that layup on quite a lot of speed, and it affects the accuracy. Like she sometimes misses those shots, and I'm just left wondering why that was the choice, why she didn't just step in normally and take a steadier shot and use her time, use her 3 seconds. The second quarter, the Firebirds started to fight back. At this point, I thought, oh my gosh, are we going to see a Giants and Swifts repeat here? Are the Mavs going to make a huge comeback? They definitely started. And the moving circle worked really, really well with Abby and M. Moore. M. Moore had a really good game for the most part, clearly trying to fight for her starting spot back after losing it to Abby in this game. But I really thought that the Firebirds' defense picked up their game in the second quarter, because we actually saw 2 held balls by the Mavericks in this quarter. So they were doing something right, and they actually won the second quarter going into halftime. Personally, I think that they should have kept the moving circle with M, Moore, and Abigail.
I think this is the most consistent we've seen Mavs play. I know that they've been struggling for a few weeks on their starting strong, and I think they were able to start strong this game, which is a credit to hopefully whatever they're working on behind the scenes. From the games we've had this round, when you're watching a game like this, it feels very, you can tell the level difference in the level between, the top 5 compared to the bottom 3 teams when they verse.
A little bit anticlimactic, I think, is what we were saying during this game. I do want to point out a really great moment by Macy Gardner, and the way that she kept the ball in play was so impressive on like an athletic level. The third quarter, Mary had a couple more misses, and then we saw a few changes in that shooting circle again. And really at this point, all of the shooters were just not on their game. Mavs defense had just completely outplayed them here. The whole attacking end kind of started to fall apart. In the fourth quarter, I think it was clear that Mavs were just going to take this win quite easily from the Firebirds. There was no fight back left at all. Shira was no match for Jock. Let's just put it that way. I think Shira has a lot of great qualities, especially when she's leaning over that shot with shorter shooters. But I think, unfortunately, in this game, she was, yeah, no match for Jock. That's when we also saw that really hard hit to Palmy between where she was sandwiched by two Firebirds players. And I think this is going to be our natural progression into our highlights and chatting points of the week, which is going to be what we touched on quickly earlier. What is actually constituting as dangerous play and what are the fair consequences in these scenarios? Because it feels like at the moment, and I know we don't talk about the New Zealand League and the English League, but you know, those leagues seem to have taken a very different stance in how they are addressing quote unquote dangerous play. So, yeah, what are your thoughts, Jenna?
But that hit in particular with Macy Gardner hitting Palmy, who then hit her into Abby, I think that was quite a hit because we almost saw Palmy land with a head smack on the floor. I think in that moment, I think we did hear the umpire say that Macy needed to adjust her timing, but I feel like that was quite a hell of a hit. I think maybe that should have been escalated into a dangerous play because, as you said, where do we draw the line? If we're letting that go, at what point is it too much? Like the players need to know just as much where the line is. And I feel like there still isn't clarity around where the line is. Like New Zealand has had a few send offs so far this season, and they've been for hits much less than that.
Maybe that was a smart thing to do. Like at the beginning of the season, the umpires set the tone, because there was controversy about whether those hits were even deserving of, be having send-offs and minutes off the court and consequences like that. But perhaps that was actually a long-term strategy in that, okay, we are going to set the bar really, really soon in the season when, the games aren't as important, I guess, at the very beginning. And that's the bar that's been set that everyone knows that's the standard they have to uphold for the rest of the season. Perhaps that's what SSN should have done.
Yeah, I do agree. I think, yeah, I feel like because there isn't clarity around it, players still don't know what the limit is.
Definitely going into next season, I hope that they address this much clearer. We've definitely seen a lot of changes happen with the umpires, even after that controversy with like Rue when Lightning played Fever and the communication between the umpires. We have noticed that the umpires seem to be making themselves a lot clearer going forward when players aren't setting those penalties. If the players aren't hearing them, they seem to be, I don't want to say snarky. There's definitely been some snarky comments by umpires this season. A lot of like enough of that, or things like that, putting players in their place, and sometimes they deserve it. After that occurrence, I've definitely noticed that the umpires have made a real point of making sure everyone knows where the penalty actually needs to be set, which is a positive thing. That's a positive thing. And I'm all here for the snarky comments too.
I love a bit of cheek.
Everyone's friends, at the end of the game. Continuing on with talking points and headlines from the week. So obviously we touched on the dangerous play and the hard hits that we saw, but I really want to talk about the biggest news of the week. And there's been a bit. So let's talk about first the World Cup and World Netball changes, as well as huge global broadcasting news that we've also seen this week. So if you haven't seen what's been going on, there is actually a video explainer on my TikTok and Instagram as well. And you can also go to the Netball Talk page where Jenna is an admin. They have a lot of information there as well. So to put it really simply, we are going to have a Netball World Cup every 2 years. This is going to be a biennial event. What is also going to happen, and that we don't have much details on, is a second international biennial event is then going to occur on every other second year. That we don't have any information about. The purpose of this, from the perspective of World Netball, is that there's essentially going to be, they want to make netball more of a big deal, essentially, in the big scale of things. They want international netball to take off, more eyeballs. We want to be contenders for Olympic Games. And they also touch on a lot about the Commonwealth Games and how unreliable it can be given what we saw recently with the Commonwealth Games and netball. So I can understand why these changes have been made. Jenna, when we were talking about this, you brought up a lot of really good questions and holes in what this information had in regards to, like you said, does this actually create more questions than answers? So tell me what you think about this big announcement.
Yeah, I think, I'm always someone who more netball, that's great, but I guess I can't help but think on the other side of it where you get the players, especially in leagues like SSN, which is quite a high stakes league. I guess I worry about their ability to have downtime and potential risks of injuries and things like that. Because considering, for example, a year in their life, you have, well, March is Team Girls Cup. April's the season that runs through to August if you make finals. Then training camp for Diamond starts September. You have a couple of comps. You might have the first one in October, then another one in like November or early December-ish. Then you're back, and then at the same time in about December, yeah, everyone goes back to clubland for their pre-seasons for the following year. So I guess my biggest concern is that I worry that players are not going to be getting enough adequate downtime and rest time, which is essential not only for their physical health and well-being because of a potential increase in risk to injury, but also just for their mental health. When your life is so consumed by something, whether or not you're extremely passionate about it, you still need to be able to take the time away for it. These are people that also have families and lives outside of netball. So I guess I do worry about that aspect in this sense. And also having a World Cup so often as well, does that take away a bit of that element of like the novelty element? Like, oh, okay, so like, oh, there's one. Oh, I don't make this one, I'll make the next one, whereas a lot of people that could be a driving point. Okay, I've got 4 years to really make my mark, to really get into it. But then on the other hand of that, I do think it is a really good opportunity for players to get more international exposure. Possibly, does this mean then because of the increased risk and because of more tournaments, could we see like our squads allowed to be bigger, which also then brings in young ones? So I feel like the way it was presented, I feel like it's raised a lot more questions with people than it has answered.
And it's funny because they first kind of brought this to our attention about 6 months ago that they were looking at a potential World Cup to be a biennial event. And so then they've had all this time to, I would assume, iron out all of the creases and figure out all of the holes. We definitely have not been given enough information. So obviously, there are a lot of pros. We have more players who can play international, more players given the opportunity to put on, the green and gold dress, more international players across the world getting an opportunity to be seen by the eyeballs like SSN, to have that spotlight on them for a moment. There are lots of positives in the sense that, how much a team can be affected when you don't have enough squad members and you have injuries or pregnancies or all of the million of other things that can happen to female athletes. So there's definitely a lot of positives. Their whole goal is about exposure, which I imagine is about making more money for the sport. So, we need to have more sponsor eyeballs, making netball a big deal. And I think this really ties in with the obviously this has been a real group effort in regards to World Netball and Netball Australia, all of the netball big wigs, because it seems to have coincided quite neatly with the announcement of the broadcasting and the international broadcasting. So there seems to be a real clear push that they're trying to make netball bigger, and that has got to be an overall positive thing. Whether logistically they are going to be able to successfully deliver on an international event every year, I don't know. We're yet to see it. Will this mean we lose Team Girls Cup, which is something that you and I, Jenna, absolutely love and that we go to? We try to go to every year. Does this mean that, like you've mentioned as well, the finance part? So I know you've got a few more cons you want to mention.
No, just the finance part leads me right into it because it's all about, making netball bigger and allowing other countries to have opportunities to play in this league. But that's where it comes down to finances, because if you're having a tournament and only certain countries like Australia, New Zealand, England can afford to run that international comp, what happens to those smaller nations that don't have the backing or the funds to make it? So I feel like if you were to run an international worldwide tournament, but then only a select few countries could make it, would your particular ranking really be a true reflection of where you actually stand in the world? Or we, even with the bigger places like Australia, New Zealand, England, sort of Jamaica, South Africa, things like that, they might not even be able to afford going to every comp. So imagine if Australia can't make a comp, or New Zealand, and then another team wins. How does that work in world rankings? Because it doesn't seem like it would then be very like an accurate representation of where everyone is actually standing if there are people being excluded. And I feel like that's another huge talking point, because, you know, as much as we want netball to grow, it's still on its way growing, and there's money unfortunately makes the world go round. So I struggle to see how it is financially going to be viable for
I would
not only the
really
big ones but the small.
I'd really love for them to release more information in regards to also how this ties into how they have strategically changed the structure in regards to the plate and cup strategy structure that we have. I don't know. I'd like to think that they've obviously thought this out. Like I'm kind of I want to restrain judgment until we have more information, because I don't want to think that they have gone to all of this expense, time, research, massive workload, and not thought these things through. So I'm really, really waiting for more information on that. And I hope that all of our questions will be answered, because it's a negative. We saw that they announced that the Fast Five World Cup would be on pause. But then in positive news, we then saw there's also going to be the introduction of a men's World Cup, so there's expansion there. And I guess some things need to, drop off in order to make space for other things. But in regards to the broadcasting, that's kind of cool.
Yes, that's good news. Get more eyes on netball.
Let's jump straight into player of the round. For me, it was the incredible Kira Austin. Obviously, the Vixens won that game against Lightning, and she was an absolute standout. She has been for the last couple of rounds for the Vixens. And, I did say to you as well, Jenna, that I think that if Lightning had won this game, then my MVP would be Steph Fretwell. She was also fantastic, but Kira Austin was just quite unstoppable. Very interesting stat as well about her intercepts that they highlighted on Pivot last night, which was that she, I don't know if it was overall or if it was just in this round, I can't remember, but that she was matching intercepts with two diamond defenders in Tilly Garrett and Sunday Ariane. I mean,
Yeah, I want to fact
impressive.
check that.
You want to
I do
fact
want to
check
fact check.
that?
Yeah. Mine was Sligo. I just think she's just building so well, and she contesting every single ball. She had a hand in everything in that game, and she really did fight to the end for that. So I think she's just really exciting to watch, and maybe that she might have some diamond eyes on her too. So you never know, but I think she's just a very exciting player, and I think she steps up for her team when it's needed.
Definitely. We're going to have to do our diamond selection predictions soon. That is it from us from the Round 11 deep dive. Thank you so much for listening to this episode all the way through. If you can, please give us a 5-star review on Spotify if you enjoyed this episode. Every single review really, really helps us grow and essentially have more people find us. Share this episode with your netball besties, and also tag us in your Instagram stories, and just let us know what your thoughts were on the things that we chatted about. And you can also send through your suggestions after the rounds have happened. Definitely send through DMs and let us know what you want us to talk about.